All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're gathered tonight, many folks virtually because we have this
Ooh,
hurricane coming in,
yes, safety first.
and all of you brave souls who are physically with us tonight in the space.
Yes, yes.
Yes, make
Thank you
some
for
noise.
coming. Yes.
We are here with the one and only Dr. Susana Morris. And we asked Susana Morris to be with us um, to talk about Octavia Butler. Now, there are some people who might think they can talk about Octavia E. Butler.
Many people can.
A
Many
lot of
people
people
can.
can. A
Yeah.
lot of people think they can.
Oh.
And yet, we asked you because the theme of our Charis birthday in November is Take Root Among the Stars. That is from Parable of the Sower. And we realized that maybe not everybody has read Parable of the Sower. They still want to be conversant in understanding Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, maybe just a little overview of Octavia E. Butler. And you are the person to do it because you are about to publish the definitive biography of Octavia E. Butler.
One of them. One of them. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
So, for folks who don't know, Susana Morris is an associate professor of literature, media, and communication at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She has been an Anschutz Distinguished Fellow at Princeton University and was most recently the Norman Freeling Visiting Professor at the University of Michigan. She is the author of Close Kin and Distant Relatives: The Paradox of Respectability in Black women's literature, which was she was co-editor with Brittany C. Cooper and Robin M. Boylorn of the Crunk Feminist Collection, and co-author with Brittany C. Cooper and Chanel Kraft Tanner of the Young Adult Handbook, Feminist AF, The Guide to Crushing Girlhood. She's a co-founder of the Crunk Feminist Collective and has written for Gawker, Longreads, Cosmopolitan, Ebony.com, and has also been featured on NPR, the BBC, Essence Magazine, and the New York Times. She is in the final stages, I think, of a cultural biography of Octavia Butler called Possessive Obsession: The Life and Times of Octavia E.
Thank
Butler.
you.
So here we go. We're going to kick it over to you. We're going to learn about Octavia Butler, and we're going to invite folks to ask questions as the time comes. So if you're physically here, I'll bring the mic to you. If you're online, just put your questions in the chat, and we'll read them out.
Thank you so much, ER. Can y'all hear me? Awesome. First of all, thank you to everybody here physically, and thanks to everybody watching at home. I want to say a little bit about Octavia's life. If I, since I'm writing this book, I'm calling her Octavia, right, rather than Butler, because I am a scholar. So usually, I tell my students you have to use last names. We don't know these people, and usually, what happens too is because I teach Black women's literature, what I find is students get very familiar very quickly, right? It's sort of a legacy of white supremacy that, like, oh, we're going to call her Zora, like put a handle on it, I get Southern, right? But I've had to become like emotionally intimate with Octavia Butler, so I call her Octavia. um, so Octavia Butler was born in 1947 in Pasadena, California, the only surviving child of her parents, Octavia Margaret Butler. So she was a junior, right? Named after her mother, and Larice Butler. And so her father died when she was young, a baby. Her mother and grandmother and extended family raised her in Southern California. And from an early age, Octavia wrote stories. She wrote stories about Western tales, right? She loved horses her whole life. She wrote stories about horses. And she, just was scribbling in this big pink notebook. And one day her mother looked at her kind of offhandedly, said, maybe you could be a writer. And that was a spark, one of many sparks. There are all these different moments. So she ends up, graduating from high school, going to Pasadena City College, a local junior college, and getting an associate's degree in history. And she's like, I'm going to be a writer. It's going to be my professional job. I don't want to do anything else. But she was a working class Black woman, right? A neurodivergent working class Black woman. And so she took temp jobs, right? Not unlike Dana in Kindred, if you've read Kindred, who's kind of patterned after herself. And so Butler would work these jobs where she didn't have to be like nice and friendly to folks. She worked in factories, she cleaned houses, she cleaned office buildings, things like that, and then wrote at night or wrote early in the morning. And so when she's about 29, she publishes her first novel. She publishes a bunch of novels in the 1970s. So Pattern Master in 1976, Mind of My Mind in 1977, Survivor in 1978, Kindred in 1979, Wild Seed in 1980. She was busy, 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 busy. And throughout the course of her life, she wrote some short stories. That wasn't her forte. I mean, they're great. We love Bloodchild, we love Speech Sounds, but she felt like that's not really where my heart is. Um, and then, in the 1990s, in 1993, she publishes Parable of the Sower. And then a few years later, Parable of the Talents. She wins the MacArthur Genius Award. It's called the MacArthur Fellowship, but we knew she was a genius. So we'll keep with that. In 95, and publishes her final novel, Fledgling, in 2005, and then passes away suddenly, unexpectedly, and way too early in 2006. So it's a super, super quick timeline of her life. If y'all would be so gracious to allow me to read a little bit from the book. It's still in progress, but it's due soon. So keep me lifted up. So the book is called Positive Obsession: The Life and Times of Octavia Butler, and I'll read just a couple of pages from the intro, which I'm titling so far, "So Be It, See to It," which is a phrase that Octavia said a lot and wrote in her diaries, right? So I start with a quote from Parable of the Sower. Prodigy is, at its essence, adaptability and persistent positive obsession. Without persistence, what remains is an enthusiasm of the moment. Without adaptability, what remains may be channeled into destructive fanaticism. Without positive obsession, there is nothing at all. Octavia E. Butler came into my life at the exact moment when I needed her. It was the summer of 1996. I was 15, shy, awkward, and nerdy, and trying to figure out who I was. I knew I was the daughter of a single mother, a Jamaican immigrant. I knew I was smart. I was a student in the International Baccalaureate program at my magnet high school, but I felt the weight of all I was not. I wasn't middle class or popular or pretty. I was an accidental loner who spent her Saturdays taking 2 or 3 buses to find a well stocked library. One particular Saturday, I was browsing the stacks in the science fiction section at the Lauderdale Lakes Library when something caught my eye. It was a picture of a Black woman. Her eyes were closed, and she had a tiny globe suspended between her upturned hands. I was immediately enthralled and grabbed the book. It was called Parable of the Sower, by an author I'd never heard of, Octavia Butler. The book was about a Black girl, a teenager who lived in the future apocalypse of 2024, whose ideas might just change the world. I was floored. I looked around wondering if I was being pranked, and then I went to the front to check it out. It was exactly what I'd been looking for and exactly what I needed. That day, I checked out Parable of the Sower along with Julia Alvarez's How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, completely unaware of how both books would change my life. I packed both books plus a bunch of random paper bags into my suitcase for my summer trip. That year, I spent part of my summer at my aunt's house in the hamlet of Old Harbor, less than 40 miles from Kingston, Jamaica. South Florida isn't that far from Jamaica, but that summer it felt a world away in a few ways. Back home, my mom and I lived in a 2 bedroom apartment in a building with a little courtyard. We were flanked by huge apartment buildings and squat duplexes. Ceremonial palm trees dotted my street, and the largest animals I routinely saw were raccoons and the occasional wild ducks that roamed my neighborhood. For me, the most dangerous creatures were the grown men who lurked near bus stops and just outside the school, who were all too eager to trap a naive young woman with a street life or a baby. So I spent my time with my head down, doing my best to get good grades and achieve my biggest dream, to leave Florida behind for a place where ivy grew on the buildings. I was in a tender space, not quite grown, but not a kid anymore. Even though I had spent summers in Jamaica before, that year I felt particularly out of my element with my family in rural Jamaica. The novelty of my Americanness was only a dim patina for my much cooler teen cousins. After a day or two, they ditched me to chill with their friends while I sat transfixed, on my aunt's veranda reading about Lauren Olamina and Earthsea. My aunt had a large farm. Cows greeted me at the gate. Bullfrogs the size of my hand croaked and jumped in gullies that overflowed after the summer rains. Goats nibbled at the guinnip tree at the side of the house. Farm dogs and cats prowled at the back door of the kitchen waiting for their scraps. In the distance, the blue mountains towered overhead. At night, it was so dark it was easy to believe we were the only people on earth. Looking back, it was the perfect time and place to receive the message of Earthseed. Quote, God is change. Everything you touch, you change. Like Lauren, I was raised in the church, but I was also struggling with its conflicting messages. I felt stymied by all the rules, the hypocrisy, and the lack of grace. Earthseed's message was frankly refreshing. I had begun to question the notion that God was either a jealous, angry man in the clouds, prone to fits of smiting, or a benevolent deity that somehow still allowed terrible things to happen. The idea that the only constant is change and that we humans, even working class black girls with big ideas, have the power to truly shape our world for the better or worse was thrilling. I encountered a parable of the sower at a time when I wasn't sure that my black girl self mattered much. And here was a story of a black girl with the power and knowledge to change the world. She was smart and brave and invited others to be more kind and empathetic. At the same time, I was clear about the cautionary tale that Octavia was spinning. I'd grown up during the waning years of the Cold War and in the shadow of the Gulf War. I'd also grown up with the daily warning that the days were being shortened for the elect's sake and that Jesus could come any day. I wondered what life would look like in 2020 or 2040. Would Octavia's warnings about climate change and fascism come to pass? Lauren's musings and experiences set thoughts in motion for me that I grapple with to this day. So I'll skip ahead a little bit here. Let's see. Okay. Octavia wrote in a genre known for its prescience in science, technology, and social issues. Nonetheless, her work stands apart from her notable peers. Certainly, as the first Black woman to consistently publish science fiction and fantasy, she is a trailblazing pioneer who paved the path for dozens of writers to follow. However, Octavia's life and work is radical in other ways. She wrote with an intersectional lens to convey how multiple systems of power, from patriarchy to white supremacy, have affected and can continue to affect humanity. She routinely envisioned futures with Black women at the center, changing the course of human life and culture, modeling how those who are often dismissed and erased have the knowledge to shape the to shift the landscape of the world. She did this not by writing up magical Negro martyrs. Instead, she wrote tough, flawed, intelligent, interesting characters who were well rounded and complicated. Octavia wrote cautionary tales that warned us about succumbing to fascism, gender based violence, and climate chaos while offering alternate paradigms like alternative religions, ways of forming family, and understandings of our relationships to ourselves. And she did all of this in prose that is at once incisive, exhilarating, and transformative. So I'll say a couple more things and then I want to sort of get us to talking. So I don't talk as much. Um, Octavia Butler was born into a world that failed and often still fails to recognize Black women's genius. Despite this and the fact that she didn't have any direct models for the life she wanted to lead, she forged ahead as a writer, teacher, and mentor. When she died suddenly in 2006, the literary world mourned the passing of a creative giant who left the world too soon. Yet, despite dying in her prime, like so many other Black women writers like Audre Lorde, Toni Cade Bambara, and June Jordan, Octavia left the world with a treasure trove of writings and a rich legacy. Her story is one of determination matched with brilliance. Octavia frequently told aspiring writers to, quote, forget inspiration and focus on habit. She doggedly pursued her goals despite the obstacles, variously struggling with poverty, self doubt, writer's block, and depression. She once wrote in her journal that she would be a best selling writer, that she would buy her mother a house and buy herself a home, and that she would sponsor underserved Black writers with scholarships to the Clarion's Writer Workshop that helped her spur her own career. She encouraged herself and declared, so be it, and charged herself to see to it manifesting to launch herself into uncharted territory and create the life she dreamt of. She became a best-selling author. She created acclaimed works that reflected her genius. She inspired generations of authors. She paid off her mama's house. She moved to her dream city of Seattle and bought herself a home. She did all that she imagined and more. Yet Octavia's story is still too far in the shadows of literary and cultural history, and a fuller story deserves to be told, which I'm trying to do. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. So one of the things that, I started working on this book in 2020. And so during a pandemic, right before the pandemic, I started working on this book in February of 2020. Right? Yeah. So I was also teaching a graduate course at Georgia Tech, and I had my students read this book and some other things. And I feel like every time I'm teaching parable, the world is on fire, because the world is always on fire. And so in 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, I recall that there were all these listicles where people would say, like, oh, you need to read The Handmaid's Tale, and you need to read The Stand, right? And I don't have any problem with either book, although I don't, well, okay. I find Stephen King scary, and ER knows that. But it makes sense. The Stand makes sense. It's a story about a respiratory virus that, all over the world. And The Handmaid's Tale, we know why people should read that. But I was not seeing Octavia Butler's name as much. This was before Parable went on the bestseller list and all of that. And I thought, this book is set in the very near future, and so many of the things that Octavia talked about have come to pass or are coming to pass. And so she disliked being called a prophet, right? Because she called herself a student of history. She had a degree in history. And I would say, even though she did not complete any other degrees, she went to school many, many times and considered bachelor's degrees, PhDs, and all that. Octavia Butler probably earned 10 PhDs with the amount of research that she did on her own. She was a huge proponent of public libraries and spent a lot of time in the Los Angeles Central Public Library. She just researched so much. And so being called a prophet, although there are multiple definitions of a prophet, oftentimes when we talk about prophets in sort of popular culture, we mean like someone who's been like divinely inspired and like they got a download from the spirit, right? And she did not believe that that's what was happening. She says, I'm looking at these patterns, right? And I think these particular things can happen because they've happened before. And if we don't behave in a particular kind of way, who knows what's going to happen next? Actually, this is what might happen next, right? And so I would be telling people, like, you should read Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, because Octavia is really giving us things to sort of think about. So I was heartened to see on July 20th, 2024, which is the day that Parable of the Sower is opening, right? It's a epistolary novel, so it's a bunch of diary entries. And so Lauren Olamina's first entry is on July 20th. But I was concerned with some of the like cynicism that I was seeing with some of the posts, right? Because I believe that those of us with radical politics, those of us who want to see the abolition of prisons or any kind of carceral systems, or those of us who are imagining a radical reframing of human life, cannot afford cynicism. I don't think we can afford that. I think cynicism is for the privileged, right? And if we're really trying to tear stuff down, we have to have some level of optimism. So I call myself an Afrofuturist, which simply means that I think that Black people, all Black people, not just cisgender Black people, not just straight, all Black people are central to the continuance of human society. Our culture, our ways, our epistemologies, the things that we practice, whether we are deeply embedded in a spiritual tradition or atheist, whatever it is, Black folk are central to the continuance of humans, right? And if we believe that, Octavia believed that, other writers like Toni Morrison write eloquently about this, then we have to believe that what we're doing now is going to matter in the future. And something that I tell my students often is, I believe that folks who were abolitionists for slavery were Afrofuturists, right? If you're living in 1780 or 1802 or something like that, and you're imagining, like, I want chattel slavery to be abolished, you may not live to see that happen, right? But you believe that it's worth fighting for. And I don't just mean like a Frederick Douglass, I mean the person who was on the plantation who said, not today, right? I'm going to burn these crops. I'm going to do whatever I need to do to survive, to resist in all these different ways, right? That's a kind of futuring, right? So when I move through the world, I'm thinking about those ancestors that I had that, they laid a foundation for me to do this kind of radical reworking of our societies, right? And so I'm not going to see many of the things I want to see. I mean, I'm in my 40s now. I hope to live a lot longer, but a lot of things that I want to see are just not going to happen in my lifetime. But I hope 100 years from now, 200 years from now, if we haven't destroyed the planet, right, that folks will look back at us. Man, those early 21st century folk, they really, I mean, they messed up the planet, but they try to do their best to rework it, right? They had weird notions about gender, but they were trying to abolish the binary. Like, all these things that we're working on now hopefully can be manifest in the future in particular kinds of ways. So Butler's work is incisive and it's difficult, right? It asks a lot of us as readers, as thinkers. And that's a good thing. They're also art, right? They're political, and I've written this book sort of thinking through Octavia's political thoughts, her sort of intellectual trajectory, and she had a lot of political thoughts. She filled notebooks with, this is what I think about Ronald Reagan. She hated that man. And there were pages and pages and pages of like, and let me tell you why, and all this kind of stuff, right? Which was really good. But it's also art, right? And I don't think those things are separable, art and politics and all of that. So along with my idea about like us not being able to afford cynicism, I want to echo Audre Lorde and so many folks who talked about poetry, art, literature, whatever creative things that we're endeavoring to do, also being central to our revolutionary practice, right? And so I want us to also think about Octavia's works as pieces of art, right? Alongside like politically incisive works that convict us and challenge us and invite us to consider all these new possibilities. So I think I've talked enough. I would be interested to hear what folks, I'm sure there are probably questions online, maybe, I don't know, or the lovely folks who are here. What brought you out tonight? What is your relationship to the parable of the sower? And, how do you see the text showing up in 2024? I know I've asked a lot of things, but you can answer any of those things or none of those things. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I've had this book on my list for so many years, and this year I was like, this is the year of Octavia.
That's
and
right.
I just finished grad school at the end of last year.
Congratulations.
So coming into 2024, and I honestly had no idea. I had read Kindred and like a couple other things like years and years ago, but he had never read any of them when we listened to the audiobooks together. So we decided to start reading them, and we started reading Parable of the Sower in June. And so like it opens with July 20th, 2024. And I'm like, what? That's like in 3 weeks.
Right.
So I was like, I think we're on time with this one. So I didn't even get any of the like all the stuff that came out after July when all the internet was abuzz about it. And I didn't really see any of the cynicism. And I thought the exact opposite when I read it. I was just like, I've read a lot of dystopia. I love me some like YA, like bad.
I feel you.
Yeah. I love it. I've watched and read The Hunger Games so many times, but this was so refreshing in the way that it was so not cynical. It was terrible, and the world is awful, and she doesn't turn away from that trauma, but she really doesn't give up in any kind of way. And it made me feel like when I was like, first, I remember being like in high school and realizing what was going on in Israel, growing up with Jewish parents and like Zionist parents. And I was like, wait a second, something doesn't add up. And her character made me feel like that again. That I was like, wait, with the timing, it's like in 3 weeks, this all starts and the world is on fire already. And so it just really, I don't know if I have a real question here. I guess I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that cynicism, and I guess what other people might think about like this future that we know is going to be bad. It's going to be bad first, probably even worse than it is now. We can already see that happening. But what does it look like after that? And as someone who came up in Occupy and like all of this stuff that we felt like we were really changing the world, and we did. We did. Not exactly in the direction we meant, but the fact that we know what we were short-sighted about was not looking at that future. And I wish that like all of us, this was required reading. You want to sit in the park, you got to read this book because this is what the future looks like. So I guess I'd like to hear other people's thoughts on that from like different points of view. And then like the last bit, I guess that is the question, is I just read Imagination from Ruha Benjamin, if people haven't read that yet. And she poses a question that I've been asking people like my whole life, is what is your post-apocalyptic job? And she calls it, what's your job at Acorn? So I just want to know what everybody's job in Acorn is going to be. And I believe that I will be a facilitator and an educator. I like to do research and history and like kind of break down complex topics for people. So
as it's being passed around, I just want to say thank you for opening us up. And what I meant by cynicism is not cynicism from Octavia, but more so folks extrapolating cynicism. But I agree that the works don't necessarily invite that. But, you know, when you put a work out into the world, lots of people,
Twitter will find cynicism.
Or anything, right? Yeah.
Online folks were saying how much they appreciated your articulation of Afrofuturism.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Other people.
So Parable of the Sower is my favorite book. So that's what brought me out. That and like Zombie. I was like doing comprehensive exams for my degree, and part of that process was like designing these long lists of readings to like study with each of my committee members. And I had a list that was just called Black Literary Classics, because it was just all the books that I hadn't read yet as an adult Black person that I felt like I needed to. So I put Parable of the Sower on that list, and I just remember like reading it. I was also like really unhinged during this time because I wasn't sleeping. I was just reading very quickly. So I remember reading it. I was like 3 a.m. and I just started crying, and I was like, it feels like uncanny and miraculous that someone has felt these feelings before me. And like that felt like both a roadmap and something that I wanted to be a part of. And to answer your question, I'm a poet, so I guess I would continue just doing that.
Yeah, we definitely need poetry in the post-apocalyptic world. Thank you for sharing that. Come on, Linda.
Susana, you asked what brought us out. I don't actually get to very many Charis programs these days, even though I wish I got to all of them because they're so great. And I watch some of them online, but I wanted to come tonight because I wanted to see you. That was really a big part of it. And the other big part of it is to be reminded as we're going into this 50th celebration, as I wear my t-shirt of taking root among the stars. I read Parable of the Sower when it came out. You know, I was at Charis, so as soon as it came, you know, and I have passed it on to my son, to many other people, and I love the book, but I haven't reread it for a very long time. So to get a little bit of a refresher is really fun.
Yeah.
And, you know, Octavia and I are the same age. I was born in 48. So that's kind of shocking to me that she's been gone as long as she has.
I know. It's unbelievable.
And really, as you're talking about the centrality of Black people in the future of our world, and I think of how many, you know, as you know, we just had our event with Alexis about Audre Lorde, and June Jordan was in that conversation a lot. And I've just finished Survival is a Promise, And so then in there, I get Pat Parker and I get so many other people that we lost early.
So many.
And we lost Bell Hooks much too early. And so there's a kind of, I wanted to be here also out of some kind of gratitude and in a position of learning.
Yeah.
Continuing to learn, continuing to be part of what the future is going to bring. So it just came in gratitude and in openness.
Thank you for coming. I want to also say, like, when Octavia's archive is at the Huntington Library, which is a beautiful, beautiful space. And there are boxes and boxes and boxes of things because she didn't throw anything away. So I got to see like her shopping list and read her diaries. And, you know, she was a tall, full-figured person. And she'd be like, I have to go get a blouse at Lane Bryant. I'm like, me with my Lane Bryant dress, you know. But she came to Charis, as you know. She came to Charis. And I think the first time I went to the archive, I was reading from the end of her life backwards. That's how I started. And she wrote about Charis several times because she would write in her travel diary, like, I'm going to this bookstore, this bookstore, this bookstore. So there were a few times when she mentioned Charis. And so that was really cool. Like, okay, I'm in Atlanta. I'm going to go to Clark Atlanta and Spelman. And I'm going to do a reading, you know, at Charis. So yeah.
And for Atlanta folks, she also did a reading at Oxford Books, which was the very fancy, you know, it was like the nice independent bookstore, mainstream independent bookstore in the 80s. And her experience at Charis was better. We packed the house.
Yes. No, it was only glowing like, oh, I'm going back to Charis. So, you know, yeah.
Okay, so we have a question. Thank you for this. I cannot wait to read your book. My question is related. Curious about how your reading appreciation of her for the first time at that young age and in that time in the U.S. is different from reading it in today's context. And this is from Nassim.
Hey. I mean, it broke. I had never read a book by a Black person that was science fiction. I never read a science fiction book by a Black person in 1996. You know, obviously there were ones that existed, but I just hadn't heard of them. And I'm from Fort Lauderdale. And I recall that in my 4 years of high school at a very excellent international baccalaureate program, we read 2 books by Black people. We read The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman by Ernest Gaines. I read that in the 9th grade. And in the 12th grade, we read Their Eyes Are Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. And other than that, we read a lot of Shakespeare. A lot of Shakespeare. I mean, I'm an English professor, so I'm not mad. I think we should read Shakespeare and all of that. But so even in my diet of pleasure reading was very white. Because that's what I saw. And I would go to the library every week, take a couple of buses, and I didn't even live close to Lauderdale Lakes, but I was a nerd. So I was like, oh, they have a really good science fiction section. So I'll take the bus and go there and all that. So it broke me open. I wanted to be a writer. And I knew Black people wrote, but I didn't know about science fiction and fantasy because that was my particular thing. Like, I love an epic fantasy. N.K. Jemisin is you know what I mean? Like, I'm like, I wish those books were around. I mean, she's young, so I wish those books were around in the 90s, but like, oh yeah, no, N.K. Jemisin is the truth. So it really spurred me, and the parts that I didn't read from the introduction sort of talk about how finding that book, and also Julia Alvarez that I mentioned because my mother is Jamaican and my father is Dominican, and I didn't really grow up with my Dominican side, so that was the first book that I read that was about Dominican culture, and it might have been the first book that I read that was about Caribbean people more generally, right? Even though I grew up in these Caribbean enclaves, we just weren't reading about ourselves. We weren't being given books about our own experience. So that book and some other subsequent experiences, but that was sort of like the first domino. So if my students are watching any of them, sorry, this is the reason why I became a professor, is because of that moment of recognition in the library. I mean, I haven't been to that library in probably 25 years, but I can see my teenage self there, probably with some box braids because it was the 90s and I like to have, my braids done, standing there like, and snatching the book like nobody else better get this, you know what I mean? Because I can't believe this is here. So to fast forward, I began my career as a Morrisonian, right? So I studied a lot of Toni Morrison. I'm a for real Toni Morrison fan because I have this beloved quote on my arm. Like, I'm serious about Morrison. There's kind of a cottage industry around Toni Morrison, and a lot of us write about her because there's so much to say, right? So it's no shade. But after I was writing my first book, which is like an outgrowth of my dissertation, so I wrote about respectability and Black women in the late 20th century, early 21st century, writing about family. I basically needed to go to therapy and talk about my own family. That's what was happening, right? So that was talk about a cleanse. Afterwards, I needed to do something else. And so I had read Fledgling in the late 2000s for fun. And I was like, I should write an article about this. I should. And that shifted my whole trajectory to like, oh, now I'm going to write about Octavia and other folks, and K. Jemisin, Black folks, Black women, and non-binary people who write fantasy and science fiction. So Parable of the Sower has been a linchpin for me in particular kinds of ways. And I'm finding that my students feel the same way, right? This is not like, oh, this was written back in the 1900s, as they like to say. And I can't connect with it. It's not simply because it's about the near future. It's resonance, right? It's the way that Octavia is able to talk about being a young person who's voiceless, who's coming into voice. That's something that young people, I think, really deserve to read. I feel like I went far afield, but I hope that answered.
That's a great answer. And we have three really great questions. So Mark asks, what was your process for getting permission with yourself and with Octavia to dive into her life, her perspective, and her desires for the future?
That's a good question, Mark. That was actually really hard in some ways because I am a literary critic. I'm not a historian. And so I think I know historians who are also writing biographies, and they're just like, this is what we do. We in the archive. And I'm a late 20th century, early 21st century scholar, right? So archives are not necessarily a thing that I'm always going to, although I was trained at Emory, and Emory has a wonderful archive. And so I was able to, work in the archives as a graduate student. But I had to kind of get out of my own way because I still feel this, a level of pressure to honor Octavia properly. But a way that I was able to get at it is, I love that you said definitive biography, ER. I love that. But it's not going to be the definitive biography. It's going to be one of many because I want there to be lots of Octavia stories. And I'm telling one version of her life, right? So I call my book a cultural biography. Could call it an intellectual biography. So am I talking about her life and what she did and where she went, who she had a crush on? Yes. I'm talking about that, but mostly I'm talking about her positive obsession, her writing. And there could be other people who write different versions of her life. So there's already a lovely middle grades biography, right, by E.B. Zoboy. There is a wonderful, very meticulously researched literary biography by Jerry Canavan. Like there's a beautiful kind of artist's way companion to her work that sort of invites us to think about Octavia's work and getting us to sort of think that as well. And so it's A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky by Lionel George. So I want to add my book to the pantheon, and I want there to be other books, right? So that you can take a course or make up your own course. Like, okay, we're going to read these Octavia biographies and we're going to intersperse it with her novels and short stories. So I had to just kind of be like, girl, this is not the only story. And you don't have to sort of, you don't have to write the tale. And that gave me some more permission. Another thing is, and I don't know if I can find it super quick on my phone, but this is a thing I look at every once in a while from Octavia's archive albums. Let's go to favorites. Where is it? There you go. I was able to find it very quickly. And so this is from her archive. She had a book made and it said Parable of the Sower on the spine, but it was just notes about the novel. Okay. And she wrote, So this is the early 90s. To be remembered long after your death is inevitably to be lied about. So that's a very kind of Octavia thing to note, right? And so, right. I mean, I'm not lying about her, but I'm giving my perspective, right? And so I feel like she's in the great beyond, like, okay, girl, I definitely wrote that, but that's not the conclusion I came to. Like there is a level of imagination that happens with biographies, even when you have 8 million pages of diaries and all the receipts and all the things. There's some level of interpretation, and it's like, okay, I'm gonna do that. I'm owning it, though. I'm not saying like I'm telling you the truth. Like I'm not trying to lie, but also people, she said, that was a great question.
So this question comes from Laura Sullivan. Laura says, even though Octavia did not interpret her prophetic abilities in spiritual terms, so many people take up the parables in spiritual ways.
Yeah.
For example, drawing on earthseed, but not only that. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the political uses and implications of the spiritual dimensions of the parables?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. All these questions have been great. So Octavia was raised in a very strict Baptist sect, a little apostolic, like long skirt, the jean skirts and stuff. I don't know if there are any church people here, but church people online. And so there were things that she basically said in interviews and in her diaries, anything that was fun for young people to do, play cards, go to the movies, date, kiss, all those things you weren't supposed to do. And from an early age, she questioned that. So she wrote in her journals, like, the pastor says this, but I actually think this. So she already had a questioning mind from the jump. But if you read any of her texts, and not just Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, which are named after stories from the Bible, right? There are all these biblical allusions and so on. So she didn't necessarily throw Christianity out, even though she questioned organized religion just across the board. Like, what's its function? Is it helping to reify the hierarchies that are super problematic? Let's think about it. But she wasn't anti-spirit per se, right? And so I think it makes sense. I mean, I've been to events where people invoke the parables, where the earthseed verses and so on. And it makes sense to me, even though Octavia said in interviews, like, earthseed is kind of a stark religion. It's not really warm and fuzzy, but there is something to think about with change, right? And that you can be an agent of change. Like things are going to happen anyway, so you might as well sort of have some agency. And I think that is empowering, even if it's not necessarily warm and fuzzy. But I have seen particularly Black folk add our own kind of resonances to earthseed, right? So thinking about ancestral practices, which that's not in the text in the way that I've seen people do it. So I think it is a really interesting launch pad. It's so expansive that you can sort of take it and go many different places.
So we got a lot of great questions coming in the chat. So I see everyone's question. I'm just gonna kind of reorder them just to give us a flow, but I'm not ignoring anyone. Can you talk about space? So what is the role of space exploration?
Yes, let's talk about it.
And why are we taking root among the stars?
Let's talk about it. Well, the destiny of earthseed is to take root among the stars. That's one of the earthseed verses, right? So Laura and Olamina, the main character of Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, creates this religion. She basically looks at the world and she's like, this is what I think is happening. She says God has changed, but really she uses the word God to kind of hook people. She's like, oh, it's a force, right? And she believes that there needed to be a sort of long-range plan to kind of organize humanity. And one of those things, since they were messing up the earth in the book and in real life, was to go to another planet, right? But she didn't have a traditional idea of colonization that we sort of see in our own world, right? Oh, we go to the moon and we put an American flag. Be for real. That's not what she was thinking about. She was thinking about humanity having a shared goal, and that could bring us together, unify us, and get us to sort of the next level out of our adolescence. That's something that that term comes up a lot in Octavia's work. Like, human beings as a species, we're young. We're like teenagers, and we're making teenage mistakes. But our mistakes can affect the whole planet and all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's one thing to think about. And I know, in our 50th anniversary of Charis, we're thinking about that same kind of shared mission, not necessarily space exploration or colonization, right? But like, how are we united around our shared politics in particular kind of ways? The other thing I'd say is like, Octavia was a young person during the space race and she was super interested in it. And she thought space exploration was a good thing. She was very into it. So when you hear things like or read things in the Parable series where there are characters sort of saying, why are we spending all this money on space exploration? It's a waste of money. These were questions that she would be writing in her own diaries, like, we need to do this. Like, it wasn't like to the detriment of feeding people or other things that we should be doing with our resources, but she thought that this was a noble goal. Again, not colonization, but exploration. She was a nerd. She's like, what are these other planets like? What are these others? Are there people out there? Are there aliens that we can connect with? So it was like a nerdy desire. So she was very much into the space race. So that's part of why you see space come up in a lot of her work.
So you mentioned the adolescent, like humans being adolescents. There's several iterations of this question. In many of Butler's writings, Parable of the Sower, Fledgling, Kindred, Wild Seed, etc., the main character has a romantic relationship with an older man, sometimes much older.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know much about Butler's personal life, so I was wondering if these relationships were patterned on relationships from her own life, or does the theme come from elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, people have had a lot of questions about Butler's life, her sexuality, who she was into, and so on. And my conclusion is that she was a complicated person. I didn't see evidence of like May, December, what were they calling it now? Age gap relationships in her own experience. Partnership was something that she really sought but was sort of elusive, right? So she dated, she met people, had encounters and experiences, but like that long-term partnership was pretty elusive for her. I didn't get any impression that she was necessarily dating super older people, but in her writings, like when she's like writing notes to herself about her own work, she talks about her writing as being erotic, as being sexy, right? And of being like jarring in a particular kind of way. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see the age gap. I mean, Lauren is 18 and her boo is like 50 or 60. Like, it's every time I teach the book, my students are like, what is happening here? They're super weirded out. And if anyone has read Fledgling features main character Shori Matthews, who is in her 50s. She was about the age that Octavia was when she published the book. But she looks like a tween. And she's biting people, she's killing people, and she's having sexual encounters. And I taught a seminar on Butler the spring of this year and the fall of 22. So we read Fledgling in both classes, and my students were like, "We love Octavia Down, but I have questions." You know what I mean? And a part of that, I think, is to get folks uncomfortable. It's not. I don't think it's necessarily condoning, things that we think are problematic or problematic power relations, right? But more so, like highlighting these are things that happen, and what happens when you have somebody who might be a brilliant young person and an older person and they come together, right? But I would argue that it's not an endorsement. It is a way to capture the reader, maybe even repulse them at times. Yeah.
Can you speak more generally to Octavia's inspiration for Laura and Olamina's dream of making a home among the stars specifically? Why that character's?
Yeah. So Parable of the Talents is the sequel, right? That was published a few years after Parable of the Sower, and it outlines Lauren's experience and the other folks who have fled Southern California to Northern California in trying to create this home acorn where they can exist despite the crumbling of the infrastructure of the United States, right? Excuse me. And I don't want to give too much away, but I guess I'll have some spoilers. Their dream is dashed, right? The fascist Christian Americanists or the Christian nationalists, invade and violate them, and they're all scattered, and there are all these traumas that happen from them simply trying to create a home. And at the end of the novel, we get an elder, Lauren Olamina, and people are going to the stars. They're going to take root among the stars on a spaceship called the Christopher Columbus. And she's too old to go, right? She could go, but she's like, I'm gonna let other people go, right? And Butler, in her archives, in Octavia's archives, there are fragments of sequels. She wanted to write a bunch of sequels. So like parable of the trickster, chaos, clay, basically all the things that she describes change as or God as. She wanted to have these sequels, and so she had versions of. So let me answer it in another way as well. So one of the things that in terms of space exploration and taking root amongst the stars and folks having this united mission, what Octavia was really interested in was them getting to another planet and things going wrong. What happens when you have your ideology, your philosophy, right? God has changed. Everything you touch, you change. But you get to the planet and the planet is hostile to you. It's not that you're there and you're pushing out folks who were already there, indigenous to the planet. That's not the issue. It's the planet itself is like, you don't belong here. And I'm trying to eject you. But you can't go home because you were on a generation ship or what have you. Like, this is where you are now. So how do they kind of use their religion to create home in particular kinds of ways? But she didn't finish those texts, right? There are fragments of them and so on. So thinking of home in that way, so that we have the destruction of home in Parable of the Sower, and then at the end, the creation of a new home, and then again, the cycle of creation and destruction. And you sort of see that in the fragments that are there. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, several folks had questions about why she shifted to write Fledgling instead of continuing to work on those parables, because the rumors of, well, there's a third book, there's other stuff have been out there for a long time. Do you have a sense of why she made that shift?
Yeah, she had writer's block. She had a version of writer's block. So if you read interviews, and there are many interviews of Octavia out there, you can watch them on YouTube. There's also a great book, I think it's with the University of Mississippi Press, called Conversations with Octavia Butler, and it's compiled a bunch of her interviews. Also, Strange Matings is another excellent book of Octavia's interviews. And so people were asking her, 99, 2000, well, hey, we heard that there was going to be, and she would tell them different things, like, I'm done with that, I'm never doing it again. But then when you go to the archives, she's working on it. She was working on it all the time. So when I say writer's block, she was creating things that she didn't think were fit for other people to see. She was writing, but she was having like a mental fog. So her mother dies in 1996. She was an only child. It was a devastating loss. And then she had these aunts also getting ill and passing away thereafter, and other people in her family dying. It's just like a devastating time. She was very much a family-oriented person and loved her family. And so I'm a middle-aged person, and I talk about this with my friends where we're like, oh, we're in this space where our elders are getting sick and transitioning, right? And then folks who are parents or caregivers are also taking care of young people. So we're like in the sandwich generation. So there was a version of that Octavia was experiencing, like in her own personal life, that was really difficult. The other thing I would say too is, and there are some folks who have written about this, scholars like Tari Pickens and Sammy Shalk, who write about disability studies. So check their work out. But Octavia had a lot going on. So, working class, neurodivergent, she self-diagnosed as a dyslexic. And I do believe there's some folks have said that she did get a formal diagnosis later. And I imagine, I am not a medical doctor, just a PhD, that some of the language that we're using around neurodivergence that wasn't necessarily available to her back then, if she was around now, she may identify differently. But working really hard physical jobs, not having health insurance and having to pay out of pocket for like dental issues, having precarious mental health, right? Being depressed, sometimes being suicidal. So we get to the 90s and she's won all this money, this MacArthur grant, right? She's able to do all these things, but like, I know it's corny, but like the body keeps score, so there are things that are showing up for her. And that's also affecting her productivity. Butler published about 12 books, right? in her lifetime. And that's a lot, right? We would agree that that's a dozen books. But if you look at her peers, and I'm going to qualify this in a moment, like Ursula Le Guin or Samuel Delany. I mean, Ursula Le Guin lived to be quite an elder, right? And was publishing for a long time. And Samuel Delany is still alive, right? And publishing, right? So her peers were very prolific. And this was something she felt very upset about. This was something that she wrote about and thought about a lot. Like, I'm not productive enough. I write too slowly. I read too slowly. I should be publishing more, because in science fiction and fantasy, people be pumping out the books, right? But she didn't have the same support that many of her peers had, right? So all the things I mentioned in terms of her physical and mental health, her financial precarity. So Octavia had 6, 7, 8 books sometimes out. The books would be out of print. She would get very small advances. And so there are moments, even in the 1980s, where she's like, should I go back to the temp agency? She's already published Kindred, her magnum opus, right? Should I go back to the temp agency? Do I ask my mother for money for a loan, right? Because being a writer, unless you are, a muckety muck, you might have to have a day job. You might have to do something else in addition to publish these novels or write these poems, right? Because we don't necessarily pay artists in that way. So I read her writer's block and the things that she's experiencing as a culmination of lots of things, like very material issues around health, both physical and mental. Yeah, I think that's the thing. It's people sometimes ask me, like, what's the hardest part about writing this book? And there were a few things, but one thing that's related to that question is it's hard to read in her diaries and the interviews and the things how hard her life was. Her life was hard. Her life was really hard. Not surprisingly, right? But her life was really hard. So even when it got really good, right, she still had to deal with the stuff from when it wasn't great, right? And yeah.
I think we have 2 more questions. Did you learn anything about the names that Butler gave to her characters? So Olamina reversed is Animalo.
So she was very particular about the names. She would change names sometimes in her journals and so on. Doro, who was a character in the Patternist series, she came up with that name when she was a child. Okay. So her juvenile handwriting, she wrote Doro, and she talks about that in interviews and so on. So she came up with the character and the concept as a young person, right? Like middle school. And then when she was older and, working on Wild Seed, and again, she was a meticulous researcher and, spent lots of times in libraries and so on, to write the Xenogenesis series, she went to the Amazon on a research trip so that she could properly describe what the atmosphere would be. I mean, a serious researcher. So she was similar with the names, right? So she would pick things that meant something. Okay, so I want my characters to be Igbo, so I'm gonna look at Igbo names, right? Or I'm gonna call my character Lilith because we know that Lilith is a particular figure, even though it's never mentioned really in the series. It's just her name, right? But she's this iconoclastic kind of figure, right? In religion. So yeah, she was very particular about why she named things. But Doro was a cool fact that she just was like, I came up with that name and came up with the concept of the Patternist series, the proto concept of it as a young person. And so there's a funny story that I tell in the book where she's maybe in middle school or high school and her friends are sort of, talking about like, well, if you could have a superpower, what kind of superpower would you have? And some people are like, oh, I'd be invisible. I would fly. And they say, Octavia, or Estelle, that's what her friends called her, what would you do? And she's like, I would want to live forever and breed people. And they were like, ooh, girl, why would you say that? And so she laughs about this in interviews and things, because that's like a weird answer. Why would you want to do that? But she makes Doro a villain, right? And she says that in one of her interviews, like, well, at least I made him a villain. But sort of interested in that sort of concept. But yeah.
I love thinking about creepy little middle schooler.
We all have a story like that about ourselves. Like we said something super weird. It's like, oh, I remember when I said that. Yeah.
That was not the vibe.
That was not the vibe.
At the cafeteria table.
No, right. Like screech.
So this is a more general question. Can you speak a bit to anything you found about Octavia Butler's research process in your own research? So how she did her research.
Yeah.
Maybe how that's affected your research.
Yeah. One of the favorite, like I said, she went to the Amazon. She did all these things. She spent a lot of time in libraries. But the research that she did for Kindred was super interesting and like affirmative, right? Again, I'm a researcher, but I research by reading books and other people's things, right? And so, of course, in this project, I had to read many things, right? And it was clear to Octavia that in order to get the emotional feeling of slavery as a person born in 1947, right? You know, integrated in Southern California, all of that, that she would have to go to Maryland where the book was set and look at plantations and touch artifacts like shackles and, you know, see neck harnesses and all the things. So it's not just something she's imagined or read in the book, but she would go to the place and sort of get a feel for it. She also did, so she did that, and I can talk more about that. She also talked to her family members who were older, who were not enslaved, but who knew people who had been enslaved, right? So elders who would have known elders when they were children who had been enslaved, right? And so she was like, what was the experience of growing up around folks who had that experience? Like, what did you feel like hearing their stories and things? So she did personal research. She, you know, went to college in the 1960s when Black Studies programs were being inaugurated. But I just told the story of being a high schooler in the 90s. I graduated from high school in 1998, and I read 2 books by Black people. So, you know, she went to high school in the 60s, and she was not reading books by Black people. So she was going to the source. So the like Maryland Historical Society, she just went to lots of different places to get an actual feel. She read many first-person accounts of slavery by formerly enslaved folks and by slavers, because slavers wrote books too. This is how you are a great slave master, right? She read all those things. She read, there's so many slave narratives from folks, elders in the early 20th century that like the Writers Project, the WPA, you know, under Roosevelt, you know, FDR championed, right? Like, okay, it's, you know, we're going to give people jobs. We're going to have artists go and talk to other people. And so we can capture history that's fastly dying. And so she read a lot of those accounts. She read accounts. One that really stuck out to her was a slave narrative by a Black man who was owned by a doctor, and he was experimented upon, right? And so what Octavia says is Kindred is a sanitized version of slavery, because the versions that she read in the archive, she could not create something that was as devastating. And if you've read Kindred, you know that it's serious. I personally find it to be the scariest book I've ever read, because the idea of I'm in the shower, I'm exfoliating, and now I'm in the 19th century. As a Black person who is a descendant of formerly enslaved Africans, y'all can keep that. I don't like time travel in general. I'm not a fan. I don't want to go backwards. I don't think I want to go forward either. Let me just stick with where I am. So her research process of iterating, really thinking, you know, and she would work on multiple things at once. So as she's writing Kindred, there are also notes about Wow Seed, right? Completely different. And she also was like, can I put Kindred in the Patternist universe? So there's a version of Kindred, it's like Doro's there, you know. She's like, that's not going to work. She has notes about xenogenesis, which will be published years later. Like her mind was just, you know, all over the place in a good way. So she had a long iterative process. She took research very seriously. Again, the 10 PhDs. I mean, she read all kinds of first-person accounts, secondary sources. If she wanted to describe the flora and fauna of a place, she would go there and she would look at it and she would take notes. So there are notebooks filled with, this is what the flowers look like in this particular part of Northern California. For example, for Parable of the Sower. She's from Southern California, so she did not drive, never learned how to drive. She would take like the Greyhound, and she would be on the Greyhound, and she would just get off at the different cities, and she would go do research trips to be like, okay, the mountain ranges look like this. The desert looks like this here. She would talk to people. I mean, it's just super meticulous. So it was, I know how research works, but it was just so fascinating and heartening and also challenging. Like, well, girl, maybe you need to step your game up, because Octavia was really out here researching things so deeply. And I think that, and this is my own personal hobby horse as somebody who teaches fiction, right? Oftentimes I hear, like, when I talk to people and it's like, what are you reading? They're like, I only read nonfiction. I'm serious. Fiction is serious. It's hard to write fiction. And if you're reading Octavia or Toni Morrison or whomever else, our greats, these are folks who did serious research. Morrison did serious research to write Beloved. Everything that Butler wrote, everything that Octavia Butler wrote, she thought about for a long time, and she wrote many drafts. She put a lot of work into it. And I think there's sometimes a privileging of nonfiction because it's fact, it's real. Be for real, right? And what she says about Kindred is, obviously, she says you should read the historical accounts, right? You should read them, of slavery. But what she wanted to do is get people of her generation, so she's a baby boomer, right? She's coming of age during the 1960s, so during the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power Movement. And I don't think I've told this story, but I tell the story wherever I go, and it will be in the book. Kindred was catalyzed by a conversation that she had with a friend in college, right? So they're like sitting around like Black Student Union type stuff. It's the late 1960s. And they're just, this friend of hers is just very well versed in things around slavery and the history of slavery. And so they're like, he's cool. He knows a lot. And so he's saying something basically like, you know, our ancestors, our elders have held us back because they just weren't strong enough. And if only, and I'm paraphrasing, if only we would be able to move forward if we got rid of that generation. But I can't do that because I'd have to take out my own parents first. So Octavia's like, that's wild. But that conversation stayed with her. And so she wrote Kindred for many reasons. But one of the reasons was, okay, you can read a history, but not get the emotion, right? Because that's what you got out of reading the slave narratives. That's what you got out of reading the histories, is that people's ancestors were punks. That didn't sit right with her. So she thought, I have to get a modern reader, someone who had been a young person in 1976 with a novel is set, or a young person today, a modern person who's not connected to slavery, or so they think, to put themselves in the shoes of folks who were not necessarily Maroons or revolutionaries, the sort of everyday folk who had everyday types of resistance, right? Resistance could be choosing to love, even though you know that you may be snatched from your loved one, right? Maybe it is running away. It could be any number of things, but she didn't want folks to sort of say, the enslaved people, we have to just sort of throw them away. And those of us who are around now are more revolutionary. She wanted people to rethink that. So her research, she had that idea in her mind, but when she went and did the actual research, that was corroborated in all sorts of ways.
Wow. I know we could keep talking all night, but I want to honor everyone's time and the fact that there is a storm continuing to brew outside, and I want everyone to get home safe who's here. Thank you everyone for such beautiful and thoughtful questions. It seems like we got a lot of Butler scholars in the chat as well, which is great.
Come on, Butler scholars.
We will be celebrating Susana Morris's book as soon as it's out. Next summer we'll be doing the biggest launch party ever and shouting it from the rooftops. But if this conversation has whetted your appetite for Butler's work, you can click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy the parables from Charis. Of course, we do also carry all of all of Octavia Butler's other books that are in print. Some of them are still not in print, or they're in kind of weird configurations, but what is in print is available through us. We would love for you to purchase those. We'd also love for you to take root among the stars with us on November 2nd at our birthday party. That's a dance party, and we'll be, also reading poems and talking and taking pictures and doing all those things. You can find out more on our website about that. We'll also have an in-store party. We'll be doing some writing, making some art throughout that whole week. So if you're not interested in a dance party, but you want to be with us, there are lots of ways to plug in. And again, we're centering it. There's an election on November 5th. We're trying to hold space that entire week for all the various things that are going to be happening. So let's get one more round of applause for Dr. Susana Morris.
And I'll be at the party too. I'm gonna be the MC.
There you go. I was saving that the best notice for last, which is Susana Morris was our longtime board chair, my partner in crime, and so there was nobody we wanted more to be our MC than Susana. So we're really, really excited. As you can see, she can hold her own in a room. So it's going to be really, really fun. So thanks to everybody watching online. We're going to go ahead and say goodnight to y'all and stay safe out there.